Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Trump Immigration Policy Using the REMI MRUS Model. This webinar is being presented by Dr. Frederick Treyz, Chief Economist and CEO at REMI, Chris Judson, and Manager at REMI. And I'm Brian Reel. I'm thrilled to be the host of this webinar. At REMI, our mission is to inform public policy. We provide software that allows government decision makers to test the economic effects of their policies before they're implemented. We work in the fields of economic development, tax, transportation, energy and environment, equity, and more. If you have any questions about REMI specifically, I encourage you to reach out to our team at info@remi.com. We would gladly connect with you. If at any time during this presentation you have a question, I encourage you to enter that question into the question box. And time permitting, I'll moderate these questions to our speakers afterwards. If we don't get to your question, we'll be sure to reach out individually. So don't let that be the reason you don't ask a question. I also want to remind everyone that shortly after the presentation concludes, a copy of the slides and a recording will be shared to you through email. If you have any questions, once you have a closer look at these, I encourage you again to reach out to that email address, info@remi.com, and we'll connect you with the speakers. Also, a new reminder, the new GoToWebinar has the ability to zoom in. So if at any point during this presentation there's a chart that's too small or a graph that's too small, you can actually just zoom into it by using the plus or minus buttons or zooming into it through your scroll wheel. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and take it away, Fred. Hi, Fred, you're muted.
Yeah, thank you very much, Brian. And thank you for joining us on this. We're looking at immigration policy. I think we're going to know a lot more in 1 week about the direction of new immigration policy. But this immigration has been one of the major political issues of the recent presidential campaign. And it's also been a very important factor in the macroeconomy of the United States. Historically, and even in the near term, it's been a very important aspect of that. And the focus of today's presentation is we find a lot of people that we're working with are interested in what does a change in a national policy or immigration policy, it could be other policies like tariffs, but what is the effect of a national immigration policy change on states and regions of the country. So we're like showing methodologically how we use something called the REMI Multiregional U.S. model to show how a national policy change then affects a specific region. So a multi-regional U.S. model is a macroeconomic policy analysis model, REMI model, that's built with regions that encompass and cover the entire United States. So when you add up all the regions in the model, it equals the U.S. economy. That could be constructed, for example, as all 50 states and DC. So if you run a national policy, you can see how it affects each of the states, and then adds up to the national total. Or it could be a two-region model. Let's say the state of Missouri as region 1 and the rest of the US as region 2. So you can impose the policy at the national level, but then you have all the interactions happening between the states, like movement of people and trade between the states. So you can see how the implications that it would have on any one particular region. Chris will be demoing this. I think another thing that may be of interest to participants is that we're showing how some of our new AI developments can help streamline the process of creating graphs, interpreting the results, and writing up the results for an analysis. So that's another exciting thing about this webinar. Our experience in immigration is, I suppose, reasonably deep. It's been of interest to state policymakers for a long time with different studies in Texas and Massachusetts and elsewhere. And then also we had the honor of being part of a team doing a comprehensive analysis for all 50 states in DC during the negotiations on the so-called Gang of Eight comprehensive immigration bill that was put forward and actually passed the Senate in 2013. That covered a lot of different areas, ag and temporary tourist visas and undocumented H1Bs, H2Bs, and that we actually hosted one of the, or perhaps the only bipartisan event in the Cannon building with Denham and Cardenas talking about this immigration issue. We know that didn't pass. It failed. It failed the House, or wasn't even brought up in the House. And then again, we had the experience of being part of a team tracking the legislation, doing the policy and economic analysis, which was done for the Business Roundtable, and that was leading up to the 2016 election, with perhaps the possibility that comprehensive immigration reform was going to be on the legislative agenda. Starting that, and at that point, the politics went a different direction. So that that did not actually swing the legislation, but we feel that the economic analysis is very important to understand these issues. One of the areas we're concentrating on, and it's really a methodological study, not a definitive study, is looking at the H-1B program, which has gotten somewhat of a play about, like, should we keep it? Should we expand it as one area of immigration? So what's really bringing attention to immigration is the big uptick in immigration that we've experienced after COVID, and we see this Congressional Budget Office chart, which has gotten a lot of attention. I think Trump has actually signed it for the Zelk brothers or something like that, and a big bump up post COVID. There's these are all projections from CBO, and but in fact the numbers we've seen on immigration since around the middle of the summer is actually not as high as the peak during post-COVID. Now, why is this important? It's not only immigration sort of as a policy issue and all the things surrounding that, but it's also a very important macroeconomic issue. And so a good portion of the recent years' economic growth has been increase in the labor force and as well as increase in productivity. So a simple way to look at the level of GDP in the United States is what's the number of people working, what's your labor force, and then how much does each worker produce. So labor force productivity, and those two numbers can tell you what the GDP is. So immigration is very important for what we see in the macroeconomy. It's very important for policy and politics, and then we see this as national policy, but it's going to potentially there can be some very large changes at the national level, and we find that states and cities are very interested in knowing what implications will this have for the state or local economy. And again, we're going to know a lot more about immigration probably by the end of next week. We don't know. There's been a lot of rhetoric on the campaign trail. We don't know to what extent this is hyperbole, or to what extent this is just setting the stage for what will really be implemented. The Congress is working on a bill, immigration, energy, and tax policy, or maybe not tax policy. So there is draft legislation, especially focused on tightening immigration enforcement rules. And then, as I was saying earlier, for this demonstration of REMI and REMI Multiregional U.S. and the AI, we're looking at H-1Bs, which is the highly technically skilled workers, highly productive workers. Elon Musk put out a little, I don't know if we call them tweets, he put out an X suggesting that this is an important part of innovation and prosperity in the U.S. Trump's sort of spoken favorably about it. Within the Trump universe, there's a lot of, or the MAGA universe, there's a lot of opposition to immigration in any form, H-1B or any other form. So, this all remains to be seen. And then we wanted to focus here mostly on how do you model this? What's the methodological approach? And then what are the likely outcomes of changes in the H-1B program? So this point, so much of an introduction, I've sort of don't want to wear out my welcome, and I'd like to turn things over to Chris Judson to continue on with the presentation and the analysis.
Chris, you're muted.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you, Brian. Our first discussion today that will set the stage for one of our simulations is looking at more of a generalized macroeconomic and demographic footprint of international migration. This particular slide reflects findings from a paper that REMI economists Dr. Frederick Trays and Dr. Peter Emigilakis developed to evaluate the role of immigration in the U.S. economy. We posed the counterfactual question: what would happen if net migration to the U.S. were to cease? So using the REMI model, multi-region MRUS REMI model, well, we set the REMI policy variable international migration to 0. So essentially, removing what the assumed baseline for international migration would be year over year between, at this time, 2018 through 2060, to estimate what the national and state level economic and demographic implications would be. Our estimates show that in absence of immigration, the total U.S. employment would peak in 2019, and the U.S. GDP and labor force would decline by 20% through 2060. Per capita income and GDP effects, however, are relatively minor and sensitive to assumptions in the labor and capital market conditions, which we'll discuss a bit further. Depending on the scenarios, there's lots of different factors to consider, of which we're happy to help our clients with assigning the appropriate policy variables. But this being a quite large effect, beginning to compile over time, and I think what's interesting, one of the components of the REMI model is the underlying economics and demographics, and secondly, it's not just the international migrants themselves, but it's the assumed for fertility rates, birth rates, death rates, and so that can begin to have compounding effects into future generations. A second study that was developed by the Business Roundtable, the economic effects of immigration policies, that was issued prior to the 2008 election, looked at two primary scenarios. One, a balanced reform scenario that would support improved border security enforcement, increases in H-1B and related reform, easier applications for green cards, expansion of H-2A or temporary agricultural work visas, temporary expansion of non-agricultural, lesser skilled visas, H-2Cs, I believe that the creation of it. There are various other visa programs in existence, but this would have been an additional program to help streamline the process, and then more of a clear pathway to legal status and perhaps potentially U.S. citizenship. The second scenario was an enforcement-only scenario, related investments in border security enforcement, and an increase in deportation, involuntary departure of undocumented immigrants. And so in figure 2, reflecting scenario 1, the balanced approach. So that's the expansion. You could think of that as an expansion of H-1B and related visas. It was estimated that the U.S. economy could expand by an additional 3.9% over a 10-year period relative to the baseline status quo scenario, accounting for an additional $831 billion in gross domestic product. This scenario could create over 8.4 million jobs over the next decade and raise the median U.S. household income by $254 a year in the next decade alone. Nearly every industry was estimated to see substantial net benefits in job creation, with professional, scientific, and technical services, followed by retail and construction gaining the most employment gains. Likewise, every state would experience faster GDP and job growth and higher household incomes than under the baseline or status quo scenario. The second scenario here in figure 3 is primarily looking at the effects of curtailing or reducing the size of the undocumented labor force. And so under this scenario of an increase in deportations, it was estimated that the U.S. economy could actually contract by 3% over a 10-year period relative to baseline, resulting in over $640 billion in lost potential GDP. Nearly 7 million jobs could potentially disappear, and median household income could lose approximately upwards of $153 in income on the first year alone. While nearly every industry would suffer widespread job losses in this particular scenario, including output declines, among the most affected would estimated to be construction, real estate, retail trade, food services, accommodations, and the like. And then we would witness slower GDP and job growth relative to the status quo scenario. So these are sort of two different extremes, and you one, and again, which was just assumptions on increasing international migration with targeted visa program expansion, and then again the other one looking at reductions in international migration only. But it gives you a sense of a balance of things, and a lot of times with our clients, if you're running an analysis comparing the various benefits and costs, it can be helpful to run them as separate simulations and then sum the impacts afterwards, as it's more of a easy, transparent visual we find for stakeholders to understand. So moreover, this is where it gets into the interesting state level impacts. Of course, this study could be done at a sub-state level, but this particular study and purposes today were focused on the state level and greater. So figure 4 reflects the balanced reform scenario. Each state witnessed net positive gains, again, both in GDP and in employment. We're seeing at a low of 2% in some states, especially those states who are relatively large, diverse economies. They do also have a significant amount of undocumented labor, but they also, depending on how the particular scenario was created with the expansion of H-1Bs, it did benefit those states with large industry clusters and high skilled professional, technical, and like industries. But again, with this particular scenario, there were also other considerations for other types of visa programs. So not, no two policies are necessarily alike. And then the enforcement only scenario, you see job losses in every state. A minimum state like Maine was, in this particular scenario, was estimated to be impacted in one of the least negative ways, but even then, potential loss in a 1% GDP growth relative to baseline, right? So these economies may still be growing, but they're growing at a diminished rate in Figure 7, again, to a deportation scenario. But then some of the hardest hit states, like New York, Texas, California, really all of the southwestern states witnessed somewhere between over 2.5% loss in GDP growth. And again, that is also tied with that specific industry mix of how it was estimated to affect different types of labor and access to labor. So then this brings us up to a bit more of a deeper dive. So again, there's some similarities, but on the right side with Figure 8, since it wasn't really looking at expansion of high skilled visas, it is more directly targeting, if you will, lower skilled occupations and its implications on those various industries. Whereas again, but you do still see downstream effects on industries like professional technical services and real estate, because of the integrated supply chains and the impacts it has on disposable income and other business costs. So this brings us up to a brief overview of the simulations that we intend to review with the audience today. And as a reminder, as we're running through these simulations, please feel free to submit your questions through the chat window, and we'll gladly review them in the end. So for today's scenarios, we assumed a 10-year time horizon. We ran some scenarios both in terms of a Keynesian, so your default no response from the Federal Reserve due to economic changes, and an alternative with the anticipatory Fed, where the Fed may step in to make changes to the cost of capital to maintain full employment. And so in scenario set 1, we look at something very similar to what Dr. Trey's and Dr. Evangelakis ran before for a NABE paper looking at the reduction in international migration. We're not saying that this is our view by any means of what we think will transpire. Again, just hypothetical scenarios to help support how to look at these types of scenarios once we have additional information. So this was the assumed reduction of 500,000 people for 4 years, and then we can see the multi-year effects from that. And then the scenario set 2 was looking at a scenario that seems to be a bit more supportive of the information that we're seeing coming out from various sources, that there may be significant support for an expansion of H-1B high-skilled types of labor that are in demand, unable to fill these jobs with the current available labor supply, and then a decrease in low-skilled labor that's more traditionally associated with more undocumented labor. But it's a balanced scenario. So we're in scenario 2, we're not assuming any direct change in the population. And so similar to scenario 1, it's 500,000 jobs a year for 4 years. and then increase in H-1Bs for that same amount. So bear with me for one moment while I pull up the model. So we have, I'll start with the occupational adjustment afterwards. First, we'll take a look at international migration running under the Keynesian closure. So the REMI policy variable was international migration. And so this treats international migrants like any other type of economic migrant in the workforce. I grouped up the genders, the ethnicities, and ages. Of course, you could make further refinements, but for the purposes of today, everything was grouped together. So not all of these people were assumed to be active participants in the labor force. We do have built-in labor force participation rates. And so just to recap, a reduction in 500,000 workers or people for 4 years. So in total, a reduction of 2 million international migrants. And we grouped together, again, these types of details on the demographics, and we grouped together all 51 states. You don't necessarily have to do that, but this streamlines the process. And so then in REMI, it will automatically spread those weights based on the forecasted values for those given years. And another note, Brian briefly mentioned before to start a presentation, in your go-to meeting application, there is an ability to zoom in on the screen. I believe you can single click and actually scroll forward on your mouse, something similar to using your browser. So we do apologize if it's hard to see some of these numbers. So in this hypothetical scenario, we do witness immediate losses in employment. Right now, I'm looking at as a percentage change relative to baseline. And with all regions together, that equals nation. You don't necessarily need all 51 regions, but typically you would want at a minimum your target area or state or grouping of states and then a rest of nation region to run this variable. As it's important to understand the shifts in nation relative to changes in a regional economy. And so the direct inputs have stopped or ceased after 2028, but you can continue to see the longer term and almost growing effects. And again, that is tied in part to that integrated survival cohort model, that then there's fewer births in the future. And so if you were to drag this out in our 10 or 20 years, you could even see a growth and further growth in these types of implications. But from a relatively small change in population, it does have that lasting effect where we're not assuming that they're then going to come back in the increased amount over time. We're just assuming these over that 4-year period we lost 2 million people, and leaving it to the model to reestimate what may happen. So there can be some effects. It could increase disposable personal income per capita. What's going on here is it could bid up demand for wages since there's some additional scarcity, but in net we would see declines in terms of GDP, output, employment, various considerations to make, and there still are some inflationary pressures that are occurring. This is the PCE price index, relatively small in this hypothetical scenario, but there are some changes in inflation due to tighter labor markets. The next scenario is more tailored to the idea of, rather than just a general blanket with a decrease in international migration, what if we were to increase H-1B visas and decrease low-skilled visas. And so it is currently estimated that upwards of 3% of U.S. population, or over 10 million people, are considered to be undocumented. So that this might be, within a reasonable scale. I think currently the cap for H-1 visas is about 65,000. So this is a significant, expansion. So we're not necessarily focused on, absolutes, but the intent is for general best practices with selecting inputs for this type of hypothetical scenario and how one could go about modeling it. So we have this variable called occupational training. We have other labor force variables to consider, but this variable allows you to go in and directly change the occupations that are now available for certain types, or for all of our different occupational categories. So what we did was we went in and we selected the occupations that in this particular example that we defined as to be more H-1B relevant visas. This isn't the definitive occupations. Oh, I'm sorry, the first one, the low skilled. So we went in and we removed occupations available for other healthcare support, cooks, food prep, food and beverage service workers, other food preparation, retail sales, helpers in the construction trades, food processing workers. The specific list may differ, especially if there's specific changes in visa carve-outs.
Are those negatives for the occupational training?
These actually should be negative. And then to balance it out, in addition of high skilled occupations, and so we didn't necessarily select all of them, but we selected some that we've heard anecdotally or seen in articles where there's significant shortages. And so be that for computer occupations, mathematical science, architects, engineers, other related life sciences, physical sciences, social scientists, and related. And then an increase of the associated jobs. So the occupational training, we just need to remove that once, whereas the jobs that are linked to that. The idea here is like both with the H-1Bs and to have an apples to apples comparison to low skilled, rather than saying we're just going to change labor costs. We wanted to say, no, we know for example, the H-1Bs, we know these jobs are in demand. Employers are unable to fill these current demands with the available labor market. And so to say, okay, well, this will directly cause an increase in employment in these sectors. So then we mapped the sectors that would be demanding these types of jobs to those occupational training groups. Now, it doesn't have to be necessarily this sector grouping. Again, it's for demonstrative purposes. And similar to for the low skilled. All right, so we mentioned construction workers and food services accommodations. So those are the types of industries that it would negatively affect. So again, relative to the overall size of the U.S. economy, and again, this was a total of 2 million people, so 500,000 workers a year change for 4 years. But again, there was no net change in the number of people. The number of people remained the same. It was just a change in the occupations available and the types of employment. And in this scenario, we witnessed net positive employment growth, as well as other growth in the underlying economics, the GDP output, the various indicators. In all cases, we actually witness net gains. There is some added inflationary pressure, but in some scenarios there can be winners and losers, but we'll go into that in a moment. But on net, there's the net positive effect throughout this forecast. Now, before we go into looking at some of the state-specific responses, which I think is certainly interesting, we wanted to show you what we've been working on for many months now, and we intend on releasing in the next few months, and we welcome any questions and feedback on this tool. We have now incorporated the use of AI to help with understanding inputs into the model, results, as well as reporting, both in terms of documents or in Word and presentations in PowerPoint. And you can go in and choose how you may want to set up a specific report. There were some general notes listed here in the under each input. The more information you give it, the better. But it doesn't really require a great deal of notes to generate. I think meaningful results for internal review, and then you can polish it further. You can change various options as well. I'll leave everything unchanged for now and select a default report. And this was the H1. So let's go ahead and generate report. It just takes about a moment to run, a minute or two to run. We don't have to exclusively utilize ChatGPT. We do have other potential options, but this is ran as an encrypted connection, and the data we have set up in the background with these decision trees. ChatGPT or whatever AI we decide to use is informed to only use the data we've shared with it. So we've uploaded all the documents about the model, the understanding of how the various policy variables work. And so all of its descriptions of the results should be limited to data that we provide it rather than data it may scrape from the internet. Now with the screen share, it's just taking a moment here to load. Okay, here we go. It's popped up. So essentially with a click of a button, it developed this summary report that, again, with further notes and descriptions, you can further fine tune this, but all of this is intended to be editable. We can we'll be able to change the preferred units and other related descriptions. But the idea is it provides you a brief summary of the types of results that you're looking at. So at the very least, internally, you can better digest the results and share it with members of your team as it talks about the economic indicators such as real disposable income, GDP, output show strong growth, indicating a robust economy, various changes in the employment and labor force, and then it can go deeper. And again, this can be customized. This is just the default report. So looking at the various components of final demand, consumption, significant increases of upwards of $500 billion a year, changes in government spending from a larger economy, changes in investment as the economy grows, and there needs to be more investment for capital expansion to support the growing economy, and in shifts in net trade. And that's what's interesting. Sometimes these scenarios, there was some positive price pressures. Is twofold. One, the model would show that there'd be increases in intermediate inputs possibly being sourced within the nation rather than from rest of the world. And two, there is some of that positive price pressure, so that can shift some of the terms of trade, and possibly in terms of exports. And then some of the employment in the key industries. So it'll immediately sort and look at some of the industries with the greatest impacts and provide some descriptions. So large gains in professional scientific services. This is twofold. The biggest effect, I think, would be the direct, but then professional scientific technical services as an agri-industry grouping, and that plays a role in a lot of these other subsectors. So even in construction, there's going to be demand for engineering services and legal services, other related services. Changes in ambulatory care services, that was associated with some of the medical professionals. Changes in, and this is an interesting one, securities, commodities contracts. That one wasn't necessarily directly affected, but that does play an intermediate input in a lot of these other sectors. And changes in administrative and support services. More detailed breakout of real disposable income by component, changes in personal income and taxes, and the changes in inflation, PCE index, as we discussed previously. In this case, again, this is a default report. Say, population, in the way this model is kind of negligible, no effect. That wasn't, that our particular simulation assumed there was no change in population. This goes into some other, further metrics, and then it provides a brief summary of looking at these changes. So overall, the economy benefits in a positive trajectory driven by high skilled labor, a focus on innovation. And then this is a report that it automatically generated. So brief abstract, an executive summary that actually goes into talking about the policy variables in I think a relatively brief but transparent manner that I think sometimes isn't included by default in executive summaries. And again, we welcome feedback, but we think this is a great leap forward in this ability to help get the writer thinking. We're not viewing this as a complete replacement, but to help get words on to the paper and think about the framework, and then using the experts to go in and adjust the analysis accordingly. Ultimately, like with favorites lists, if you have a preferred set of types of indicators that you're looking to report on, that can be built into the AI tool. Again, this is just a base default list of some of the indicators. And in some ways, we think this can also help to make these reports more comprehensive. That so many times people are like focused on like the large items like the employment and GDP output. There's other indicators to be considered and help tell that story. And then ultimately, a conclusion. Let's cancel, close, and then let's get to the state by state. You'll ultimately be able to do more of this all through AI, but again, I think that the tool itself is still incredibly helpful for this, and you can export the data and pivot the data, adjust the data as necessary. But in this occupational adjustment, so again, increase in high-skilled visas, decrease in low-skilled visas, we still actually see net gains in every state. I think Arkansas, Mississippi may potentially grow the least, where some of the largest gains, again, based on this type of industry groupings and occupations, that this may differ from actual specific H-1B legislation. So it's a bit more spread throughout, as a lot of states have these types of clusters, but states with stronger professional technical services clusters, again, we did directly impact medical. So that in Massachusetts actually we have a bit of a medical tourism community, for example. But in this particular scenario, all states were better off. Now, there still could be some shifts employment-wise. There might be some industries that are relatively worse off, but on net, and for the vast majority of the industries, we saw net gains in this hypothetical scenario. We can also look at that prior study on that reduction in international migration. So the data we have from REMI does look at and utilizes the CBO data, but there is international migration going in to each state in assumed counties. But then after year one, we assume that they can move anywhere in the U.S. to find employment opportunities like any other economic migrant. So these are the changes in international migration in this scenario, where California, we could look at as percentage change. Florida, Texas, Nevada, Arizona. California is a difference. Witnessed the greatest decrease, but as a percentage change, a little bit more middle of the pack. And again, the specific types of variables will play a role in this, but the REMI model does have built-in employment forecasts, occupational forecasts, utilizing historic data to inform the model. So it's not just a base multiplier. It is unique to a given region and the type of industry groupings, occupational axis that they have. So with that being said, I'm thinking now could maybe be a great time to open it up to questions for the audience.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris and Fred, for the great presentation, and thank you to all who stuck around so far. We've had a lot of great questions come in. I encourage you to ask more if you have any. And if somehow we're not able to get to it, we'll be sure to reach out to you individually after the presentation concludes. I also want to remind everybody that the slides and recording from this presentation will be shared to you shortly after. And once you have a closer look at everything, feel free to reach out to us. We'd happily connect to discuss it more. All right, we have a few questions. Let's get into it. So the first one is, we'd like to use custom demographic and workforce projections as our model baseline to customize model assumptions. Can you demonstrate how these changes can be made here or follow up via email?
Sure. The forecast, the baseline forecast can be adjusted using your assumptions. For example, to match the state demographer's forecast. So the way a regional baseline forecast, there's a default forecast which is delivered with the model. But then to adjust the baseline, there are various ways that baseline can be adjusted, sort of in a similar way that you do a policy simulation, but it would just be to adjust that baseline. And then probably with time constraints, it may be a little difficult to. This just shows how it's done with the employment update, the population update, the alternative model, and maybe with time constraints to actually run through this exercise. We don't have time for this, but we'd be happy to reconnect. And I just jumped in there, Chris, if you had anything to add.
Well, yeah, agreed. But we have various policy levers and ways to conform to consensus forecasts. We're happy to set up a call in the coming days to help you run those scenarios.
Great, thank you for that. The next question is, for the second simulation, why are one of the units in simulation 2 here in thousands, while the other 3 variable units are just units?
Oh, good question. That's just the unit selector. That's just what I picked. They should equal each other. I selected 1 in thousands when I was selecting the policy variable input, and maybe perhaps this other one I just selected units. Yeah, that was just the decision I did when I selected the inputs. But you as the modeler can choose what units you prefer.
Excellent, thank you. Another question is the AI feature available only in the new version of the REMI model? Is it something we can have in older versions as well?
I think it's safe to assume it will likely only be available in the newest versions of the REMI model. Time will tell, but I would view this as likely a version 3.3 going forward. It might be available before the 3.3 release.
Right now we're in beta, and then it will be released as a final product soon.
Great, thank you. Somebody asked, including the AI deliverables, can the slides and materials discussed here be made available to us attendees afterwards?
Yes, we certainly make a copy of the presentation slides available. I believe everyone will receive a link, and then we'll typically upload a recording and the copy of the slides on our website within a few business days.
Excellent, thank you. We have another question. The need to increase H-1Bs is because less USA students are studying STEM fields. If H-1B fills STEM jobs, will there be less STEM jobs for US students at a time when we are trying to increase this major in US colleges for US students?
That's a good question. I think you could modify some of the policy variable assumptions to assume increasing competition. But my understanding, the H-1Bs, they need to document that this is a current job that they're unable to fill given the current labor force. So I believe the nature of the program is not to compete, but help expand the size of the labor force that's in critical demand.
Excellent. Thank you for that. This is the last question now, but for sure, if any come in while we're answering it, we will be sure to go over them. Did you look at the effects on state and local tax revenue under the 2 scenarios?
We did not directly in this analysis. We have a model called TaxPI that is intended to be customized to reflect specific what we call state and local budgets. So like there are various different revenue categories. We could also look at changes in expenditure categories. It's a comment we're making in our conclusion slide, and that's where there's other factors to consider. But there would be assumption changes in state and local budgets. The model, the PI Plus model does give you changes in estimated state and local government spending, but it's the tax PI module that's customized by the user in our support would provide the fiscal impacts.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And this is actually the last question we have. So again, thank you to everyone who joined us for this presentation. Again, thank you, Chris and Fred, for the great demonstration. Again, final reminder that we will be sharing the materials from this presentation to your email in about an hour after it concludes. So keep your eyes out for that and reach out if you have any questions. Again, yeah, thank you so much, everybody. We hope you have a great day and a great rest of your week. We hope to hear from you soon. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.